So thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here virtually, although in listening to the last remarks by Kiffer and his team, I'm having major FOMO, wishing I was there. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's so incredible. Um, Today, as I think I heard, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the U.S. National Strategy for Social Connection. And um, although much of what I'm talking about is in the U.S., I should say I grew up in Minnesota, born and raised, and so I feel like I'm an honorary Canadian. uh, so I want to first start by acknowledging that the work that I'm going to be discussing, of course, was not done in isolation. So I want to acknowledge and express gratitude in the many people who contributed to the work, the many people who informed this work, and the many people who supported the work. So I want to start by just acknowledging that many studies that look at what kinds of factors bring us happiness. Study after study consistently, it's not wealth or success, it's relationships. And these studies are consistently finding this because, again, other studies are showing that what brings meaning and purpose in our lives, relationships are consistently at the top of that list. So it's a bit of a truism that people don't truly appreciate what matters until it's taken away. And so sadly, it was clear that the global pandemic brought greater awareness of the importance of connection for our well-being. But of course, this is clearly not a new issue. We have decades of scientific evidence across multiple scientific disciplines. However, another thing that became clear is that the pandemic really tested us and proved we were unprepared. It simultaneously exacerbated the existing problems of isolation and loneliness. It highlighted gaps in our understanding and our ability to apply our evidence into efforts to mitigate the issue. And it challenged our ability to mobilize in a crisis. So it was clear people suffered, communities suffered, and in ways that go beyond COVID-specific health effects. And so, of course, given the concerning kinds of trends of declining social connection that began well before the pandemic, getting back to normal certainly is not enough. And so, and if we fail to act, the consequences may be very far-reaching. And so this really, I think, in a way was a huge impetus to many global efforts that have been aimed at addressing this issue, including my work with the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory. But also, of course, we need to acknowledge much of the work which I'll talk about in a bit. But today, my remarks are really going to focus on highlighting what's in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory that I've been working on over the past year, or the year prior to its release, as the lead scientific editor. So just to give you a little context of what was involved in that, an earlier version of this advisory was informed by multiple government agencies, multiple non-governmental organizations, and subject matter experts. It was peer-reviewed by more than 50 external subject matter experts, and we adjudicated nearly 1,000 reviewer comments. It is not exhaustive, and in fact, the final version was approximately maybe a half to a third of its original length. because considerable effort was made to make it very accessible to the public. So, of course, that was very challenging to both represent the evidence as well as putting it into plain language and accessibility. So, in my remarks today, I want to highlight as well, not just the contents of what's in it, but some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. So, first off, how did I get here? I've been working in this space for over 2 decades, doing research on social connections. And so I started out doing a lot of basic research. Much of it was laboratory-based experimental research. Uh, and then later, that evolved more into large-scale meta-analyses that looked at some of the broader kinds of effects that this has on overall mortality, which of course kind of led to a turn in my journey to focus on the public health relevance of this, including a piece I wrote in 2017, as well as early work with the UK in terms of really focusing on this issue for public health. And so I share a photo from I think it's 2018, of myself, Vivek Murthy, the US Surgeon General, and Tracy Crouch, the first UK Minister for Loneliness. So this work, of course, began, but we often see the pandemic as or at least the general public views the pandemic as the impetus for this work, when clearly much of it came long before this. Which of course then heightened some of the urgency and public awareness around this that led to this Surgeon General's advisory. But I want to point out that, while the title highlights quite largely in bold loneliness and isolation, it not only calls attention to the potentially severe consequences of lacking social connection, but it also offers a path forward through a first ever framework for a US national strategy. So, broadly speaking, much of the advisory focuses on the importance of social connection. It's often underappreciated. It's perceived as nice to have, but not necessarily essential. And yet, social connection is critical for individual and population health, well-being, community safety, resilience, and prosperity. Broadly, on average, people who have strong social connections are happier, healthier, and live longer than those who don't. Unfortunately, far too many people lack social connection in one or more ways, compromising these benefits and leading to poorer health and these other kinds of outcomes. So the advisory really takes an approach of acknowledging the multiple scientific disciplines that contribute various concepts and measurement approaches to social connection. And so really identifying social connection as a multifactorial construct that has three major vital components. This includes the structure of our relationships, which many, in essence, get at the existence of people in our lives, the presence of others and the roles that they may serve, the functions, the extent to which we can rely on people in our social networks, and of course, the quality, and acknowledging that not all relationships are entirely positive, and that that positivity and negativity are important to consider in this. And so one of the things to keep in mind, and there's certainly a lot more I could say about this, but broadly, what the evidence points to is that measures across these three broad categories are all predictive of health. And so I think it's really critically important to recognize that this goes beyond just loneliness. So of course, loneliness is important. It is a signal, or perhaps, and some even see it as somewhat of a symptom of individuals lacking social connection. But it is not even the only indicator of lacking social connection. So it is distinct from objective isolation, and it is distinct from social negativity. And so one of the things we need to be really careful about is by focusing exclusively on loneliness, we may potentially narrow the scope of our measurement and our efforts. And so while it is a critical signal that there may be something wrong, or missing, or lacking in terms of our social connection, it's not the only indicator, and we need to take a broader, more holistic approach. So one of the major lessons is that we have is that social connection is critical to well-being. And while the general public associates this issue with emotional well-being, of course, the range of outcomes is far broader, pointing to social connectedness as a core public health primary prevention strategy. And so the advisory, my own work, and decades of interdisciplinary research is based on the premise that humans are fundamentally social species, and that this social need is reflected in our neurobiology that can shape our thinking, our behavior, and our functioning. So, for example, evidence points to dysregulation across multiple biological systems when various social needs are not met. And if this is sustained over time, dysregulation can lead to the development of disease. The social environment, both early in life and in adulthood, is one of the strongest predictors of both morbidity and mortality across social species in nature, including humans. In addition, experimental studies across these species show that social interactions can causally alter physiology, disease risk, and lifespan itself. So in my own work examining mortality risk, we gathered the available data globally, including population data on over 3.4 million participants. And when initially healthy people were tracked over time, those who experienced social deficits were more likely to die earlier, regardless of cause of death. So more specifically, we found that loneliness increased earlier death by 26%, isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. In a more recent meta-analysis with more studies, so 90 studies, however, a smaller sample size, so 2.2 million, so must have had a more narrow inclusion criteria, found consistent findings in that both loneliness and isolation were significant predictors of mortality. However, social isolation, objective social isolation, was significantly stronger predictor. Now, conversely, in an earlier meta-analysis of 148 studies examining the protective effects of being socially connected, we found that social connection increases the odds of survival by 50%. So beyond this, of course, we know that there are many meta-analyses and now hundreds of prospective studies with millions of participants, and this isn't even a comprehensive list. But it does underscore the replicability of these findings. And I just want to note that as some of this earlier data also uses larger sample sizes and more rigorous methodologies. And so I just share this this benchmarking figure for a couple reasons. So although it needs to be updated with this newer data, what we see is that these social factors, which are depicted in the orange bars, are quite comparable to many of the clinical risk factors that are prioritized and receive considerable amount of attention and resources in public health. Now, while many of the effect sizes are relatively consistent in this newer data, uh, I do want to point out, though, that even among the social variables, those in the orange bars, there's considerable variability even among these indicators. And so some of them are much stronger predictors than others. And interestingly, one of the lower ones is loneliness. However, that's the one that seems to get the most attention. And what this data suggests, however, is that among indicators that focus more on social connection or assets of social connection, those effect size seem to be relatively larger than the effect sizes that are focused on deficits of social connection. So another major lesson to be learned from this is that social connection goes beyond just emotional well-being. It is critical to our survival. And this evidence goes beyond deaths of despair, and the evidence goes beyond loneliness. This evidence is also consistent with research that shows the influence on physical health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes, mental and behavioral health kinds of outcomes, including depression and anxiety, suicidality and addiction, cognitive health outcomes, including cognitive decline, dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, and economic health kinds of outcomes, including healthcare spending, as well as larger kinds of economic costs associated with low workplace productivity, absenteeism, and quality of work. Importantly, we also have evidence of how it is that being socially connected can influence these kinds of health outcomes through biological processes, psychological processes, and behavioral processes. So we have the plausible mechanisms by which this can occur. So another major lesson here is that while we know that this has significant benefits to individuals, the benefits of connections extend their powerful influence to also benefit communities. And so this is beyond just an individual issue, this is also a community and societal issue. So in fact, we devote an entire chapter of the advisory to focus specifically on communities. And so the benefits to connected communities range from population health to community safety, resilience, prosperity, and representative government, while lower levels of social connectedness suggest worse outcomes in each areas. And so really building resilience for the next set of challenges, including many kinds of crises, will enable society to withstand some of these unanticipated crises. I just want to point out a few of these. So for instance, there's evidence to suggest that more connected communities you can see how the spread of illness is less likely to occur, better kinds of responses during the pandemic. It has been linked to reductions in violence and crime. And one outcome that I think that is particularly worth noting is the ability to mobilize in a crisis. And so whether it is a natural disaster such as flooding, fires, and earthquakes, maybe a heat wave, a pandemic, a war, the ability to mobilize resources via social connection can often be a matter of survival. And so communities where people know each other and they are better prepared for, respond to, and recover more quickly from natural hazards than those with lower social connection. And I think this is quite noteworthy as extreme weather patterns become more frequent, that connected communities will be crucial to weather these kinds of environmental crises. So another lesson to take away from this is that, yes, there are many, many pressing social issues, and oftentimes attention towards social connection might be viewed as somehow a distraction or taking away attention and resources from these other kinds of issues. However, prioritizing social connection doesn't necessarily detract from these issues. It can actually potentially help us better address some of these other pressing issues as well. Another important, it's also important to recognize that, of course, a variety of factors influence how socially connected we are. And so the socio-ecological model helps us understand these issues. And so we need to, of course, be sensitive to individual situation, whether that is their health or financial situation, but we also need to take into account relationship-based factors such as the characteristics and behaviors of others in their household who may be sources of either support or strain, whether our neighborhoods are safe, walkable, provide spaces to gather, and accessible. All of these factors influence our connection. So it's important to recognize that each of these may potentially be an underlying influence on the degree to which people are socially connected, isolated, or lonely. But they can also be potential sources to promote health. And of course, change is needed across the full scope of the socio-ecological model. So in sum, the advisory points to the importance of recognizing many of these consequences, but also the importance of rebuilding connection. One critical issue that I think is worth highlighting in terms of a lesson is that this is not just a personal issue. So one thing that or one lesson that the pandemic clearly taught us, there are two important lessons. One is that clearly external factors can influence social connectedness. So we often think of this as being someone's personal responsibility, and yet we know that external factors are important here. The second is that social contact is part of almost every aspect of society. And this became clear when policy aimed at reducing social contact altered nearly every aspect of our lives, from how we work to going to school, travel, shop, how we get our entertainment, and so much more. So this clearly demonstrates the relevance of every sector of society and potentially how policies can be used to either facilitate or become barriers to connection. And so really, the advisory takes a whole of society approach. Now, I want to highlight a bit more of a detailed that's not included in the advisory, but because it was perhaps a bit too complex, but I think is helpful for this audience. And that is the social framework that my colleagues and I at the Foundation for Social Connection helped to develop. Social is an acronym that stands for Systemic Framework of Cross-Sector Integration Action Across the Lifespan. I know it's a mouthful. That's why we just call it the social framework. Um, but really, it takes existing, well-established frameworks, but expands on them in important and needed ways. So it first, of course, starts with the individual at the center of what we do, but embeds them within the socioecological model, recognizing that people are embedded within relationships, communities, institutions, and society. But it overlays this with the health and all policies model, recognizing the importance of sectors. And so just like um, policies are health across sectors, we can take a social in all policy framework and recognizing the importance of all of these sectors of society. So we overlay these, but we expand on them in important ways. So we recognize that these that there are important opportunities for collaboration across sectors, as well as some intersectionality across these sectors, and encourages approaches that are transdisciplinary. It also recognizes really important uh, cross-cutting themes that have to be considered as we approach this issue. And these are in no particular order, but I want to highlight them. So the first is modality. Much of our early evidence is based on in-person social connection, and the way in which we are connecting has changed dramatically. And we cannot just assume that all modalities of connecting are equal. And so we do need to pay attention to these differences and where there may be strengths across different modalities. We need to take a life course approach. For far too long, this has been viewed as an older adult issue when it's clearly relevant across the life course. And we have good evidence that early life experiences have long-term implications later in life. We also need to consider issues of inclusion and equity and access. There's far too many disparities, and much of what we do only reaches a portion of the population. And then, of course, across all of this, we need to consider both the evidence base for this as well as the approaches, practical kinds of solutions that occur across this. So I recognize this is quite complex. And so we have broken this down into a way that is much more manageable and a way that can easily track progress in this area. So the socioecological model is represented in the green columns. The sectors of society are represented in the blue bars. And where they intersect, each cell is numbered so that we can systematically identify where we have gaps in evidence and solutions and where there are opportunities. So unfortunately, most of the work that we are doing really falls under only about 2 of these cells. And so what this suggests is there is a tremendous amount of untapped opportunity to affect change. And so it's hoped that this framework can allow governments, institutions, and others to systematically identify, test, and evaluate potential solutions that can accelerate the progress in this area. So it's clear that efforts in any one sector or level are not independent, and coordinated efforts will be needed across research, policy, practice, as well as social infrastructure. So I want to just finally highlight the pillars of the national strategy to advance social connection. And again, although it is not exhaustive, it does highlight the need for comprehensive strategies. So these 6 pillars include strengthening the social infrastructure in local communities, enacting pro-connection public policy, mobilizing the health sector, reforming digital environments, deepening our knowledge, and building a culture of connection. Now, I've talked already a lot about the importance of pro-connection public policies, but I did want to just quickly highlight a few of these pillars. So the pillar 1 is strengthening the social infrastructure. And it's one of the things that we realize is that our built environment, the places that and spaces that we have to gather in society, or even the structures that become literal barriers to connection, can all influence how connected we are. And so this also includes some of the programs that exist in these spaces as well. And so we really need to invest in this infrastructure to promote social connection and invest in local institutions that help bring people together. I will also want to highlight Pillar 5, which focuses on deepening our knowledge. There are many areas where our evidence is strong, but the public just may not recognize this evidence. And so greater education and awareness efforts can be applied. However, there are also areas where our evidence is where we may still have some remaining gaps that we need to strengthen. Just going to quickly highlight a few of those. So we have strong converging evidence across scientific disciplines. This is quite remarkable because many different disciplines are measuring this in different ways, and yet we consistently find generally similar kinds of findings. So this is a real strength. However, a challenge that arises from this is because of this variability in conceptualization and measurement, we don't have a single measurement approach. And so we need a multifactorial assessment kind of approach. We also have very strong evidence on mortality and cardiovascular outcomes and depression. But there are fewer studies across other kinds of disease outcomes and other kinds of health outcomes, as well as less evidence in underrepresented groups. So we do need additional kinds of basic research to fill some of those gaps. We do have evidence of a gradient effect or dose response effect of social connection across the lifespan. But we have fewer studies that are looking at this in younger ages. And so we really need to broaden our scope across the risk trajectory to focus across ages. We also have strong evidence or strong converging evidence across different components of social connection. But what's unfortunate is that they're often studied separately. And we have few studies that examine them in the same sample. And so it's harder to understand the independent, additive, and synergistic effects that may be needed to more precisely assess risk. And then finally, while we have robust evidence on many of these health outcomes, we have mixed or weaker evidence on interventions and fewer studies looking at prevention kinds of effects or prevention approaches. And so we do need more evidence on how do we put this into practice and translate this. And so the last pillar that I want to focus on is pillar 6, which is cultivate a culture of connection. And so while national strategies might include and focus on programs and policies that can be really impactful, uh, unfortunately, even if we build these places and put policies into practice, if they don't support our social norms and the values of our communities, some of these may fall flat. It's often the informal practices of everyday life, how we engage with one another, that can significantly influence social connection. And so, one of the things that this advisory points to is the importance of a culture of connection that rests on core values of kindness, respect, service, and commitment to others. And while this may seem idealistic, of course, there is research that has examined pro social kinds of approaches, but it's critical that not only do our leaders model these values in their positions of influence, but we need to expand our conversations of this in the places where we are on a daily basis, such as our schools, our workplace, and our communities, so that each one of us can contribute positively to these social norms. So, in conclusion, this slide simply gives an overview of the key takeaways from this advisory. But I want to just end by saying I hope that we can go beyond just focusing on a particular crisis and operating in crisis mode, to really truly building sustainable efforts to help individuals and communities not just to survive, but to actually thrive. So, thank you.
Hey, am I going? Live. Excellent. So we're basically just going to have a Q&A session now, but I just want to say a couple of words first. So first of all, of course, we're all talking about human connection. We're talking about community. This is a beautiful community forming all the time, and everybody plays critical roles. Of course, Pete is our fearless leader, and we need his strength, we need his passion, we need his voice out there. But Pete also needs support in what he's doing. And people like Julianne and Kiffer, with the work they are doing, are so critical. Because, I mean, just to put this in context, with research, there's sort of two levels of research. There's basic research, people in the lab finding stuff out, and then there's the hard work, which is translational research. If you find something in the lab that's powerful, and I am here to tell you there is no variable more powerful for human well-being than social connection. It's just unambiguous. You go to the literature, it is the variable that we want to be focused on. But getting people who are not geeks in the laboratory to understand the importance of this and to actually create this movement is really, really powerful. And so the work that Kiffer and Julianne are doing to do that, to take the research from the labs, to communicate it to politicians and to people, is really incredibly important for our movement, for really getting to that next step. So I just want to thank you both. I love how Kiffer put this in terms of Indigenous principles. I'm not seeing Kiffer right now. Oh, there he is. Oh, great. I'm like looking where you were. Fantastic. I thought that was great, that interconnectiveness. So let's have a Q&A session. We're going to have a Q&A session for a bit. Julianne has to leave at about 11:20, so we want to say goodbye to her first, so we'll break that up for a good goodbye, and then we'll continue the Q&A a little more with Kiffer at that point. So for now, let me just open it up to the floor. Yeah, Adam.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Julia. Great talk. Appreciate your work bringing attention to this very important issue for decades now. Yeah, it looks like there's a problem. It looks like loneliness is a problem. It looks like social disconnection is a problem, more and more so with the youth, it seems. And I'm really concerned about what to do with it and how we can be really having an impactful effect on improving this situation. And as you mentioned in your talk, there's the issue of needing research about what interventions are effective for moving the dial on this, tremendous tragedy in the making that we're seeing. And I'm wondering if in the United States, if the situation has improved in terms of funding work to really look for impactful interventions with really like rigorous testing to identify the things that can really move the dial in a reliable way? And if so, if that is improving, what can we do in Canada to similarly improve the situation?
Okay, so I think I heard the question. It's really difficult for me to hear. So I think what I heard was to what extent do we have efforts that are effective or being launched among our young populations, and what can be done there, and the effectiveness. So uh, what I can tell you is that there are many large scale kinds of reviews. In fact, I also participated with the Campbell collaboration in terms of uh, identifying, mapping and gapping, the gap map exercise of interventions. And what's became really quite clear is that most of these interventions are uh, focused on older adults. Many of them are focused on and at the individual level. And so there's a really ripe opportunity to work with younger populations, particularly our youth. Not only are they the highest prevalence rates of those who seem to be reporting the highest levels of loneliness, but it's also, if we think about school-based approaches, it's a way, and I assume it's the same in Canada, but in the US, public school is available and required for all kids. And so it's something, of course, not all public schools are equal, and some are better than others, but at least if there were consistent kinds of education-based programs or programs in the schools, we can reach a huge portion of the population. We can reach those that are often hard to reach. So there's a key opportunity to interact with our youth. Of course, we ideally we want to start even sooner than that. Even pre-K kinds of programs, because again, what I mentioned is that we have very good evidence that early kinds of experiences are significant predictors of later outcomes in adulthood. And so this is a critical period to intervene. I'll share with you one example that I was really quite surprised by recently. Some data. It's I'll caveat it. I was speaking at the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. So this is state level data, and it's Utah. But what they found with their the BRFSS data, which is behavioral risk something survey. I'm forgetting the exact acronym, but you can look it up. But it's the measurement of loneliness. What they found was that, of course, similar to other data, it was significantly higher among the youth compared to adults of all ages. It peaked in 10th grade. But when they looked at who was most at risk, again, not surprising, it was among adolescents who were members of various what would be considered, marginalized or minoritized kinds of groups. For example, adolescents who were identified as LGBTQ plus rated significantly higher loneliness than others. But what was really fascinating, and to get to this point of kind of what can we do, I found it somewhat surprising that on this, adolescents who reported not having regular family dinner were 3 times more likely to report being severely lonely compared to those that did. And what was surprising was that that was more so than even being non-white. Uh, and so, what I think is so fascinating about that data is that it's really difficult to make significant changes or to change the biases that exist in your community. And those things often are slow to change. They need to change, and we need to do more work with that. But something as simple as having regular family dinner uh, seems like something that's far more in people's control, particularly for families, and what they may be able to do, and something that often gets neglected in our busy lives. And so I just offer it not as a this is the solution, but rather we need to start thinking about some of these more simple ways that can potentially have a tremendous amount of impact that we may not be paying attention to.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm hopeful that you can hear me now, Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad. My name is Dr. Sandra Allison. I'm a public health physician and a family physician. And I'm very interested in trauma impacts in our communities, individually, at the community level, and at society level. Organizations that are traumatized have practices that are maladaptive, including increased authoritarianism. How do we change the tide of the pandemic and this trauma and free up community to be empowered and realize their potential? So I feel like there is some dependency, some learned helplessness, and I'd like to understand how to do that. Thank you.
Wow. Yes. First off, that is something that we spent quite a bit of time discussing, considering, engaging with experts on this as we worked on the Surgeon General's advisory, because this is critically important. And it touches, as you say, so many different areas of life, from our healthcare system, where healthcare workers are high rates of burnout. And we really wanted to be cautious and careful about thinking about this, not only from like the healthcare sector approach, but then also thinking about the kinds of kind of community level kinds of trauma that we have been experiencing as well. And perhaps things are better in Canada than they are in US. I mean, we know the Canadian nice, but in the US there's significant polarization and political polarization that's occurring, and a lot of incivility that is occurring in our communities, both online and in person. And really considering how this has widespread kinds of effects. And so I will point out, when it comes to the healthcare sector, the Surgeon General's office also issued an advisory on healthcare provider burnout. And not surprisingly, one of the ways to help with that was focusing on a community of connection among healthcare providers, and how that can help in terms of collaboration and morale and support within that community. We were also very careful to think about how, as we made recommendations to assess social connection in clinical settings, and how to respond in clinical settings, that our healthcare system is already quite taxed, and wanting to make sure that this is approached in a way that does not provide additional kinds of burdens, and in a way that can help both providers and patients in a way to increase our health more broadly. We did focus a bit on civic engagement and how it's we were careful to think about how in many cases people are having they may feel quite connected to a particular group that is very insular and that treats others in a way where you have your in-group versus out-group kinds of mentality, where anyone outside your group is perceived to be less deserving in a lot of ways, and can lead to discrimination and other kinds of poor treatment, and how we can encourage the importance of being able to connect across differences, and how that will be so important to these larger community and societal kinds of outcomes. And so we need to start thinking beyond just the individual approaches, because if not, we are going to get, if we are so focused on the individual, what's good for the individual may not necessarily always be good for society in those kinds of cases. And I'm thinking particularly of extremist kinds of groups that may not be able to see others as equally deserving of various kinds of access or resources. So I know I'm kind of, this is just so complex. It's hard to know where to begin and where to end with this. It's something that, I encourage you to look at that section of the advisory, but I also want to acknowledge that it doesn't scratch the surface. There's so much more that really we clearly need to do in this area. And if we don't, it's going to be devastating consequences.
Thank you. My name is Franco Taverna from the University of Toronto. I was quite intrigued about your models with the role for society, community, infrastructure, those kinds of things. Two sectors that are near and dear to my heart that I've been working with is senior sectors and children, sport and play, particularly children with disabilities. And it occurred to me that in both of those sectors, getting together in long-term care, for instance, being together, or in sport and play activities, being together is inherent to those sectors and those activities, yet social connection doesn't really seem to be the focus or the priority. Medical, hygiene, whatever in one sector, and fun or competition in another. So is there a role for refocusing sectors like that towards social connection, a part of this, a part of the solution here?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that I would highly encourage, and we included in the advisory, is that sometimes our solutions don't necessarily need to be creating something brand new, but rather just emphasizing it within what we're already doing. There are so many programs out there that have social relevance. You just illustrated two of them, but we think about so many other kinds of programs that may be focused on, say, food insecurity. Well, you can add to that while addressing that, also focus on how to connect people in the process. It's these programs that we already have really can help us identify people who may be in need, because we're already working with these populations, and know what kinds of unique needs they may have, and really be able to deliver what might be most responsive to them in that setting. And so uh, sometimes it's really just rethinking what we're already doing.
Oh, geez, there we go. Julianne, it's Pete Bumbachi. I know you got to get to class, so we don't want
I
to
wish I
hold
could
you.
see you.
Yeah, I wish I could see you too. But it was great to see you last week in Boston. And just before we let you go, I personally want to say thank you for today. But also, and I'll share with the group, about 6 years ago, I reached out to Julianne when we got this whole movement started. And Julianne, who today alone has 3 presentations, and that's why she couldn't be here in person, gave of her time freely to connect and hear more about what we were trying to do at the GenWell project. And thank you, Julianne, because your words of wisdom and guidance helped us continue on this path. And here we are 7 years later, received funding, and we're now turning this into what I truly do believe is a movement that this country needs more than ever before. And I know that we're going to have continued shared learning, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you and everybody in the United States, including Kasley Killam, who's at the back of the room, and making this world a much more connected place. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. All right. See you, Julianne.
Bye.
Yep. So Q&A period. Do you still have a question, or was it for Julianne? Kiffer can answer? Okay, cool.
I actually did want to bring up that the U.S. Surgeon General has an amazing podcast. It's called House Calls. So if you haven't listened to it, he's so dedicated to social connection, and I listen to him a lot and whatnot. Kiffer, I want to see more translation of the data into real life applicability, and I know that's not your job. I want to know how I can do that and how we can do that. I have, over the years, I have 2 degrees in psychology, so over the years, like, I've heard and seen stuff, and I work now in local government, and so my job is to create a sandbox, essentially, for people to come and play in and to come and relate. So my job is to build social capital. And so I can pick up little pieces of here and there and try to implement them, but I don't have a lot of sway, for example, with our planning department or our parks department. And what I'd love is some of this data to show up at the Urban Development Institute, for example, because architecture plays such a huge role in how we interact. We have many years ago, there was this whole development of what we call garage architecture. And cars became the most important thing, right? If a 2-car garage or a 3-car garage, you're like, ooh, that's the important house, because there's 2 cars in there or 3 cars in there. And people drive up, and they automatically open their door, they drive in, they close their door, and they go into their house. And there's no front porches anymore, right? And so even the invention of the dryer, which, as a woman, not subject to having to hang my clothes out onto the laundry line in the 1950s. I would have loved that to come, into my home, but I know that when I am outside and I'm hanging my laundry out, I can talk to my neighbors, right? Whereas if I'm inside drying my clothes, I'm not talking to my neighbors anymore. So in my work, I'm really hungry for new ways to bring people together. So I just want to leave that with you and see if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, a couple of the questions that came up earlier along with that question made me think of the quote that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But we spend all our money on cure and so little on prevention, right? We don't actually work to build healthy communities. If you look at public investments in health and social services, most of it goes to paying high salaries for doctors and that sort of thing. And there's not equivalent expenses as there should be in the social and community sectors, at least to the extent that there should be. So I think there does, but I think you're right that it goes bigger than this. We're not gonna solve this problem with government spending, I don't think. I think as kind of shown in the slides, the core of our social lives are our families, our friends, our day-to-day interpersonal connections, how we spend our time. And if you don't see a fundamental restructuring of that, then what you do around the edges is likely to have lesser impact. And I think that fundamental to some of the issues you've identified is we've spent as a society here in the West in particular, and increasingly so in the global South and East, an incredible amount of global resources towards making our lives so comfortable that we no longer need each other. We have cars so we don't have to share space on a bus. We have houses so we don't have to share cooking space. You know, we've really compartmentalized our lives in such ways. And so if you want to see the world be a more connected place, I think it needs to become a less comfortable place. I think that's why activists so often say that we need to beware of our comforts, right? Because they are incredibly dangerous and isolating. Western society will give you everything you'll need. They'll put ear pods in your ears. They'll give you every distraction in the world so that you don't have to connect with the person sitting next to you. And I think we all have to make those individual choices. And I think that goes back to the fundamental work that Pete and others in this room are doing to help people reestablish a basic value. And I think if you look at the history of, say, the United States and Canada, last week Pete and I were had the chance to meet Robert Putnam, who's famous for his work around social cohesion and the rise and fall of social cohesion. If you look back at the beginning and founding of this country, people were highly individualistic. But up until the 60s, that individualism decreased and we had a cohesive society, and then now it's back to very low levels of cohesion and individualism. And I think we have to rethink how that fundamental structure is. And Bob Putnam, I was really inspired by his talk because he said, we need to fundamentally reevaluate our values. We need a revolution of our values. And if our values are about consumerism and competition and independence, then you're going to get one type of society, which is the one we have now. And if your values are about cooperation and collaboration and comfort and care of one another, then you're going to get a very different type of society. And I think we need to start preaching in some ways that the values we should have, not the scientific research, but the values we should have, should be rooted and grounded in a more collectivistic orientation.
But then we look at the data that in Victoria, the 2016 census says that over 51% of the people live alone. And what we're seeing is smaller and smaller housing being built, and that's driven by economics. We know this. But that means that really, if you're not in an intimate relationship or a parent-child relationship, how do two people live comfortably in under 400 square feet, right? And so, so our builders, our developers are creating isolation just by the very fact that they're building these small units, right? So I get it's multi-pronged and very complex, but I feel like the pendulum needs to swing back, right? We need to move into, like you said, reevaluate what's important to us, and then build housing that reflects that, build community centers that reflect that.
Yeah, I think it's a constant co-creation, right? The environment creates the individual and the individual creates the environment. And I think you have to start somewhere with that, right? And so I think if you want public policy and building codes to reflect that, first you have to have a common understanding. Developers are building the type of housing that they can sell, right? And that city councils will approve. You could get the city council to say, no, we're no longer going to approve that style of housing. We're only going to improve, housing that has shared kitchens. But then you're going to exacerbate the housing crisis, and your whole entire slate of city council is going to be voted out of office, right? Just that's what would happen in that scenario. And so we really have to start at values, I think, is my personal opinion. If you look at what really plays a powerful role in shaping some of these policies, it's the movement of the masses.
If I could just add, I don't know if the microphone works. So if I could just add to that quickly. I love that distinction, the collectivist versus the more, I don't know, materialistic Western way we've been doing things. I would just mention that the way we do it now, kids are bombarded with from the time they're born. This is the world that they see. This is the behaviors they will emulate. I think if we want to make a change, the number one spot is in the school system. In curricular, that's the one place where society can say, we want to teach kids about the importance of human connection. We want to teach them some skills. We want to maybe let them know about the paths to loneliness. And if they find themselves on a path to loneliness, well, you know, are some of these factors in play? And have you considered some of these other things? I think to get that sort of change in values, we have to have both value choices apparent to our children at a very young age. And then things like what you're talking about, the municipal construction stuff, that can echo all that. That's where we would need, you know, once you have a young population who values social connection, then if you have the spaces that support it and everything else, you're just going to facilitate the continued sort of deepening of those roots. But for me, the hope is in the school system, and we're doing, with Kiffer, we're doing some work at the university level, which is great, but I think we really need to get into primary, you know, right from the get-go, and be talking to kids about it. They're smarter than we give them credit sometimes, and they're very socially focused, and so if we're going to talk to them about social things, I think that's where we need to get. We need to do it in principled ways, which is what the process is all about.
And can I just throw on there, like, Europe's been living in small quarters for thousands of years or hundreds of years, and they seem to be very good at it because the culture is get out of your house. The house is a place to sleep, to come together, to have that family meal maybe, but what do we do after that is we get outside. So I think your point is so valid, Kipper, that it really is about getting people into a different mindset to say, you know, why do we have 28% of the population living alone, single? Maybe there's a shift in how we have to figure out how to get along with each other, whether that's roommates, whether that's relationships or whatever, because we're 100 years behind where Europe is as far as population growth, diversity, you know, and all the different things that they're facing, and we're all struggling to get through this, but I think we can help shift the culture in order to help make some of that change a little bit easier for people as we come back together.
Agreed, but Europe also has the culture of having the common square,
For
right?
sure. That's
And so, you know, I know so many people like that I speak to, we all look to that and we think of the old man playing chess in the square, but there's also the coffee houses, there's also like, so to bring people, like to create those bumping places is where I think what we need to do physically, you know, with our infrastructure, and that's where our policies, especially at the municipal level, can really take a lead.
I ran into a bunch of Greek gentlemen at Young and Warren's in the Tim Hortons, sitting in the back. There was 10 of them, and I said, as I'm known to do, "Hey guys, how you doing? What's going on?" And they said, "This city sucks," is basically what they said. This is where we have to go because we don't have a piazza. And so your point is valid, but I do believe we can find ways, even temporarily in the short term, and business can be part of that solution as well. But I think, yeah, all those solutions need to be on the table to say, how do we help people understand it and then take action?
Yeah, I think that social health in all policies is kind of the, you know, some of the language that's going around. I think that maybe even Julianne started. Yeah, it's really, we need to be leveraging everything we can, and we need mercenaries in every organization at every lower level of government advocating for that constant siren of like, but what does this do to us socially, right? Like to make sure, you know, oftentimes in government they use multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, and you know, is how they often do things is they look at what are the criteria that we're considering here. There's economic costs, those sort of things. You know, we need to make sure that every single MCDA analysis includes